My name is Kelsey. I am 30 years old. I stood in the kitchen of Stone Lodge, watching the fog roll over Lake Tahoe as chunks of gray ice scraped against the shore. My parents, Frank and Patricia, stood across from me with practiced clinical expressions. "You have 48 hours to vacate," my father announced. Apparently, my 4 years of caretaking were over because my sister, Cassandra, needed a wedding venue. Actually, it was more urgent than that. Cassandra needed the lodge cleared for an exclusive pre-wedding gala and a high-stakes press shoot to impress her new investors. Frank needed the house staged and emptied to look like a pristine $1 million set within those 48 hours. I didn't scream or cry. I just took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee and let the silence settle. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I looked at the frost creeping across the window pane and remembered the day I moved back to Lake Tahoe 4 years ago. My grandmother Eleanor had been the soul of this lodge, and when she passed, the light seemed to go out with her. My grandfather, Thomas, was left in a house that felt too large and a mind that was starting to feel too small. He asked me for one thing: to keep Stone Lodge exactly as Eleanor had intended, a sanctuary, not an asset. I'd spent my entire adult life as a financial analyst, so I approached my family with the same precision I used for a balance sheet. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, providing a level of emotional capital that no one else was willing to spare. While my father, Frank, was chasing deals that never closed, and my mother, Patricia, was maintaining a social status we couldn't afford, I was the one managing the medication schedules and oxygen tank deliveries. I became the unofficial chief financial officer of their neglect. My sister Cassandra would show up once every few months, stay long enough to take a few photos of the lake for her followers, and then complain about the depressing smell of old wood and sickness. She called it cherishing family in her captions. I called it a gross overvaluation of her own presence. I was the one who sat through the long, silent evenings when Thomas no longer knew what year it was. I was the one who signed for the pharmacy deliveries and calculated the rising property taxes. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, assuming the line of credit would never be cut off. They viewed my presence here as a given, a constant that required no maintenance and certainly no gratitude. I remembered one specific night last winter when the power went out during a blizzard. The temperature in the lodge dropped into the 30s within an hour. Thomas was terrified, his breathing shallow, as his oxygen concentrator beeped a low battery warning. I called my parents 3 times. My father's phone went straight to voicemail, and my mother told me to just handle it because they were at a dinner party in San Francisco. I spent that night wrapped around my grandfather in front of the fireplace, feeding the flames with old magazines just to keep him warm. That was the night the last shred of my loyalty to Frank and Patricia dissolved. It wasn't a loud epiphany, it was clinical. I realized then that my debt to them, if any ever existed, was paid in full. I was no longer a daughter, I was a creditor. I stayed because of the ghost of Eleanor and the fading light in Thomas's eyes. I stayed because I believed that blood meant a contract of care, not a license to exploit. But standing in this kitchen now, listening to the 48-hour clock tick, I realized that to them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. Legally, they couldn't touch me. California law required a formal 30-day notice and a court order to remove a resident of 4 years, but I didn't point that out. I didn't need 30 days. I only needed 48 hours to execute a forensic strike they would never see coming. I was just a placeholder. I was the unpaid staff member who had outlived her usefulness because the property value had finally outpaced their patience. They thought they were giving me a deadline, but they didn't realize I'd been auditing their behavior for a very long time. Love in this family had been a subscription I'd been footing the bill for, and I was finally ready to cancel. This wasn't a breakdown, this was an accounting, and the bill was about to come due. I didn't wait for the sun to come up to start the liquidation. I moved through Stone Lodge with the quiet precision of a night shift worker. To Frank and Patricia, my silence was the sound of a daughter breaking under pressure. They saw me dragging heavy cardboard boxes into the guest room, and they assumed I was packing away my pride. I let them believe it. I needed them to think the asset was already back in their control. I even labeled a few boxes in thick black ink. Kelsey's kitchen, winter gear, surrender. In reality, those boxes were empty shells, weighted down with old newspapers to make the thuds sound authentic when I dropped them. My true packing was digital. While the lodge stayed silent, my laptop hummed with the energy of a forensic audit. I sat at Thomas's mahogany desk, the one overlooking the icy lake, and began the cold work of data recovery. I'd been the silent investor in this family for too long, and it was time to pull the ledger. For years, I had worn the invisible chains of the survivor. I kept wondering why I hadn't set a boundary sooner. Why had I allowed myself to be their unpaid housekeeper, their unpaid estate manager while they lived a life of leisure in the city? It was learned helplessness. I'd been the scapegoat child, the one who was taught that her only currency was her utility. I thought if I just cared more, if I worked harder, if I held Thomas's hand longer, I would finally be enough. I was chasing a debt that Frank and Patricia were never going to pay. My sacrifice wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy within a toxic ecosystem. I'd been trapped in a house without bars, believing that my only value lay in the labor I could provide to people who only loved me when I was useful. But that night, the chain didn't just bend, it snapped. I stopped trying to earn their recognition and started focusing on their liabilities. I'd been Thomas's primary contact for years, and he had given me partial access to his accounts to manage the bills. I started noticing the irregularities. There were withdrawals from Thomas's primary trust that didn't align with his medical needs. Large, rounded numbers. $20,000, $50,000, $100,000. These weren't medical expenses. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I didn't reach for a tissue, I reached for my external hard drive. I began backing up every email, every scanned invoice, and every unauthorized transfer. While Patricia was likely dreaming of the centerpieces for Cassandra's $1,500,000 wedding, I was building a digital cage. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing the role they'd assigned me. Inside my laptop, the screen glowed with a different kind of light, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet, relentless retribution. By the second day, the vultures stopped, pretending they were here for a visit. My father, Frank, walked into the living room, his face set in that rigid mask of entitlement he used when he was about to liquidate someone else's peace of mind. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the 4 years of my life I'd poured into the foundation of this house. He just dropped a thick folder onto the coffee table. "I've already signed the intent to sell," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. "I convinced the resort group's lawyers that I'm the managing director of the family estate with a durable power of attorney. They didn't bother checking the underlying trust documents. They just want the land before the wedding season hits. A resort group offered $3 million for the lodge. The closing happens after the wedding. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the numbers. $3 million, the exact amount of his private business debt. He wasn't giving Cassandra a wedding venue. He was using her marriage as a smokescreen for his own bankruptcy. Patricia followed him, holding a silver tray, as if we were having tea instead of a funeral for our relationship. "Kelsey, honey, you have to be realistic," she said, her voice dripping with that toxic, syrupy concern. "We need you to sign this waiver of residency. It's just a formality to ensure the sale goes through without any complications." I watched them, and I realized I was witnessing a masterclass in the trap of normalized cruelty. To my parents, this wasn't theft. It was family logic. They had spent decades turning blatant exploitation into a family tradition. This is how narcissistic parents operate. They convince the scapegoat that her boundaries are a form of betrayal. Frank didn't feel like a thief because he truly believed my labor and my grandfather's legacy were just items on his personal balance sheet. He had normalized the idea that my only purpose was to be a safety net for his failures. Cassandra leaned against the doorframe, checking her reflection in her phone screen. She didn't look at the boxes. She didn't look at me. "Kelsey, don't make this ugly," she said, her eyes fixed on her own image. "My wedding is a $1,500,000 event. It's going to put this family on the map. You've always been the background character. And honestly, you're just ruining the aesthetic right now." The absurdity of the $1.5 million figure was Frank's last-ditch, double-or-nothing play. He needed this display of opulence to look solvent in front of the new creditors he was desperately trying to outrun. The audacity was staggering, but my reaction remained clinical. My father was hemorrhaging $3 million. My mother was forging a narrative of formalities, and my sister was worried about an aesthetic built on a foundation of lies. I didn't answer them. I didn't sign the paper. I just looked at the clock. They thought they were the ones closing a deal, but they were just increasing their own liability. I was no longer a daughter trying to earn their love. I was a forensic accountant waiting for the audit to begin. I took the residency waiver, folded it once, and placed it back on the table. "I'll give you my answer on Friday," I said calmly. They took my silence for submission. It was the most expensive mistake they would ever make. I drove away from Stone Lodge while the morning fog was still thick enough to swallow the road. I didn't take the car my parents allowed me to use. I took a private car to an office in the city, far away from the judgmental eyes of Lake Tahoe. This was the professional escalation. I was moving from the role of the caregiver to the role of the architect. Daniel sat in an office that smelled of expensive leather and old law books. He had been my grandfather's legal counsel for over 30 years. He looked at me across his desk with a mix of professional curiosity and underlying sympathy. He saw a daughter in mourning. I saw a specialist in asset protection. "I've been tracking the discrepancies for 18 months, Daniel," I said, placing my tablet on his desk. Frank was meticulous. He didn't just withdraw cash. He funneled the payments through a shell company he registered as Tahoe Medical Logistics. Every theft was disguised as a legitimate invoice for Thomas's specialized care. It took me 18 months of late-night digital sleuthing to prove that this company had no employees, no office, and no purpose other than to drain my grandfather's life savings. But because Thomas established a blind trust for his primary holdings, my access was limited to the operational accounts. I could see the capital outflows, but I couldn't trace the authorization. I needed your personal clearance to pull the full audit trail. Daniel leaned back, his chair creaking in the silence. "You didn't say anything at the time?" "In finance, you don't raise an alarm until you have enough evidence to secure a conviction," I replied. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, and I knew that if I spoke too soon, my father would just move the debt elsewhere. I needed them to feel safe. I needed Frank to believe his siphoning was invisible. My silence wasn't submission. It was a tactical ambush. I showed him the digital copies of the invoices I'd backed up, large, rounded figures that didn't correlate with medical care. He's been treating my grandfather's fund like a personal credit line to fund Cassandra's lifestyle. He thought he was outmaneuvering a distracted caregiver. He didn't realize he was being audited by his own daughter. Daniel's eyes scanned the numbers with practice speed. If Frank used a power of attorney to authorize these without Thomas's consent, this moves from a civil dispute to a criminal one, Kelsey. "I'm counting on it," I said, feeling a sense of relief that had nothing to do with emotion. In this state, financial elder abuse is a felony, and as a licensed professional, I am a mandatory reporter. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was a criminal investigation with a paper trail that led straight to a prison cell. The 48-hour deadline they gave me was the final confirmation of their insolvency. They need the $3 million from the lodge sale to plug the hole in the trust. They think they're liquidating an asset. They don't realize they're walking into a forensic trap. I had preserved Stone Lodge for 4 years out of love for Eleanor and Thomas. Now I would preserve it through the lethal precision of the law. I was no longer a daughter waiting for an apology. I was an accountant preparing the final notice. I left Daniel's office and looked up at the cold Tahoe sky. Frank and Patricia weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. The only sound in the office was the soft hum of the heater and the rhythmic tapping of his pen against a mahogany desk. He pulled up a series of documents on his large monitor records from a secondary account I hadn't been able to see. My eyes adjusted to the digital glow, and I felt the air in the room turn razor sharp. "Kelsey, this is the kill shot," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low professional register. He pointed to a specific authorization form dated 18 months ago. It was a request to liquidate a major portion of a tuition trust fund established for my graduate studies. The amount was exactly $750,000. I leaned in, my heart remaining steady, even as the truth laid itself bare on the screen. I wasn't looking at a mistake, I was looking at a crime. Frank had used his power of attorney to bypass the usual safeguards, but it was the signature at the bottom that stopped my breath. It looked like Thomas's handwriting, but the slant was off, and the pressure on the ink was too uniform. "He forged it," I stated, my voice clinical and devoid of any daughterly grief. My father forged his own father's signature to steal $750,000 from my future. "He didn't just steal it, Kelsey," Daniel added, pulling up a parallel ledger. The funds were transferred directly to a luxury real estate developer in Newport, the down payment for Cassandra's wedding venue and her new townhouse. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a criminal investigation. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only precision. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and this was the final audit. But then Daniel reached into his desk and pulled out a sealed, wax-stamped envelope. "Thomas gave me this 2 months before he died," he whispered. "He told me to give it to you only when you were ready to finish the accounting." Inside was a single handwritten note from my grandfather. It was the silent regret of the Sentinel. Thomas hadn't been as oblivious as my parents thought. He had known Frank was siphoning the funds. He had watched his son's greed grow like a parasite, and it had been his greatest silent sorrow. But Thomas was a builder, and builders always include a fail-safe. He had purposely left the power of attorney active, knowing Frank would eventually overreach and commit a felony that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a trap, designed by a man who loved me enough to let his own son fail so that I could finally be free. Thomas had been the original Sentinel, and now he was handing the keys of the lodge to me. "They think they are the ones closing a deal," I said, looking out at the gray Tahoe horizon. "They don't realize they are the ones being liquidated." My anger wasn't loud. It was a balance sheet, and Frank was deeply in the red. Friday arrived with a sky the color of wet concrete. Frank and Patricia walked into Stone Lodge, as if they were already the owners of record, their heels clicking sharply against the pine floors. Cassandra was right behind them, tapping her long, manicured nails against her phone screen, probably calculating the engagement metrics for her wedding announcement. "It's time, Kelsey," Frank said, his voice heavy with a manufactured authority that didn't reach his eyes. "The keys and the safe code. Now." I didn't say a word. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a plea for mercy. I just turned and led them down the stone stairs into the wine cellar. The air down there was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging oak. The safe was a heavy cast iron relic built directly into the stone foundation, a silent sentinel that had outlasted generations. Frank pushed past me, his fingers trembling with a greed he could no longer mask with corporate jargon. He punched in the code I gave him, and the heavy door gave a soft metallic click as it swung open. Inside, there were no gold bars or bundles of cash. There was a single flash drive sitting on top of a sealed legal envelope. I reached in, took the drive, and plugged it into the laptop I had already set up on a nearby tasting table. Thomas had recorded these files during his rare, lucid intervals, those brief, sharp windows where the fog of dementia lifted and the old builder returned. He had known the end was coming and had built this digital failsafe to protect me when he no longer could. Thomas's voice filled the cellar, thin and raspy from the final weeks of his life, but unmistakable in its clarity. "If you're listening to this, Frank, it's because you chose a price tag over a person," my grandfather said through the speakers. He went on to detail the exact moments he'd watched Frank forge his name on the tuition fund documents. He spoke about the $750,000 that had been siphoned away from my education to pay for Cassandra's townhouse. He called it what it was, a felony. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if the oxygen in the cellar had suddenly run out. Cassandra looked like someone had just deleted her entire social media following in a single click. I stood there, leaning against the cold stone wall, watching their carefully curated world dissolve in real time. This was the power illusion of the empty wallet. My parents' authority had never been internal. It was a costume they'd rented with stolen money and unearned status. Now that the funds were frozen and the crime exposed, they didn't have a single shred of character to fall back on. They were just hollow shells standing in expensive coats. I looked around the shadows of the wine cellar and realized that in a world without Eleanor, this house was just a $3 million exit strategy to them. They didn't see the sanctuary or the legacy, they only saw the liquidation value. But to me, this was the place where I had promised to protect the only people who ever truly chose me. The lodge is mine, I said, handing Frank a certified copy of the irrevocable trust. I am the sole trustee and the sole owner. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal items and get off my property. I wasn't just bluffing. Daniel had already helped me file a temporary restraining order, and I had reported an unauthorized intrusion into a trust-held property. To the law, they weren't family members anymore. They were trespassers caught in the act of looting an estate they no longer had rights to. As the blue and red lights of the police cruiser flashed against the high cellar windows, the reality of the accounting finally hit them. Patricia started to sob a sound that finally felt as empty as their promises. The audit was over, and they were bankrupt in every way that mattered. The aftermath was swift and total. Cassandra's $1,500,000 wedding didn't just lose its aesthetic, it lost its reality. With the trust accounts frozen for investigation and Stone Lodge legally protected under my sole trustee status, the fantasy of a resort sale evaporated instantly. Frank and Patricia were left facing the cold reality of a $3 million private debt and a felony forgery charge for the $750,000 they siphoned from my future. I didn't find peace in their downfall, but I found purpose in their absence. I used the capital recovered from the audit to officially establish the Eleanor Foundation. We serve as a sanctuary for the caregivers, the silent partners of family crises, who are often exploited until they have nothing left to give. My grandfather, Thomas, knew that my compassion was a resource that needed a failsafe, and now I am that failsafe for others. I sit on the back porch of the lodge now, watching the spring sun finally break through the Tahoe fog. The floorboards no longer feel like they're holding a secret. I've come to realize that blood can create a connection, but only character can create a family. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your compassion is a luxury, and you have every right to cut off the line of credit to those who refuse to value it. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from a contract you never signed. This is my letter to those who have always felt like they were at the edge of their own family. You were never invisible. You were just the only one with enough light to see the truth. Don't wait for them to see your worth before you start building your boundaries. Your silence can be your greatest fortress until you are ready to speak your verdict. If this story reminded you of your own strength, hit the like button and share it with someone who is still finding their voice. Justice is a journey we take together.